هەرپەیوەست با گفتوگەکانی نێوان ئێران و ئەمریکا لەسەر بەرنامە ئەتۆمیەکەی کە پێیناوەتە سێم هەفتە لەگەڵەوەی کە هەردوو لا گەشتبینن با بەرەو پێشوونی گفتوگۆکانیان بەڵام لە هەمان کاتا مەترسیژەیەکە نەگەنە ئەنجام لە نێوان هەردوو لادا. بۆ گفتوگوی زیاتر لەسەر ئەم بابەتە قسە و باسی زیاتر دەکەین بە میوانداری بەڕێز ئێرینا سوکەرمان شرۆڤەکاری سیاسی کە بەڕێزان لە نیویۆرکەوە ڕاستەوخۆ میوانی ئەم گەشتەی هەواڵە. بەڕێز ئێرینا سوپاس بۆ ئەم دەرفەتە دەمێ بۆ دەست پێ بکەم ئەوەی کێستا دەبینرێ لەسەر ئەرزی واقع ئاراستەکان بەرەو ئەوەن کە بگەنە ڕێکەوتن یاخود بە پێچەوانەوە.
If it's going to be reached, which is at this stage not likely, it's going to be reached on Iran's terms. And I don't think it's going to be an easy path to get there, despite seemingly positive signs at this moment. Today's discussions did not yield a major breakthrough. They were focused mostly on technical issue, despite being described as having an atmosphere of constructive ambiguity, and even technical progress was relatively incremental. The one major update is that there was a formal exchange of written proposals allowing for more detailed technical discussions, and Iran demonstrated a seeming willingness to consider capping enrichment levels and accepting enhanced oversight, albeit within the framework of preserving its quote-unquote sovereign nuclear rights. But we've seen this movie before. This is not the first time Iran has claimed it would cap its uranium enrichment level and then either abandon this promise or create conditions making it exceedingly difficult to enforce, or simply changed its mind at the last minute, or lied and cheated and confused the IAEA oversight enforcers. So I would be very cautious with proposing any sort of optimism at this stage, but there are longer-term issues that make the case for being pessimistic rather than optimistic. There are, for instance, two key political hurdles that are going to be very challenging to overcome. First is that Iran is insisting on the full lifting of all post-2018 U.S. sanctions before making any significant nuclear concessions. And second, Washington is refusing to guarantee the permanence of any agreement beyond the current administration's term, and they can't. And this is also what made JCPOA very difficult to agree to. There is a very deep structural mistrust, which is underlying the attempts at U.S. Iran diplomacy for decades. And it's exacerbated by the collapse of the JCPOA, the sharp ideological divide between Tehran's revolutionary regime and successive U.S. governments, and a long record of Tehran lying, deceiving, and cheating at various agreements. There is also an asymmetry in negotiating teams that will make the very process of negotiating exceedingly difficult. Iranians are masters of tough diplomacy. American teams, especially this particular team, are relatively inexperienced when dealing with Iran. And the current composition and performance of the respective teams sharply underscore this imbalance. The Iranian delegation is led by a veteran diplomat, Abbas Arakchi. He embodies decades of institutional continuity. The Iranian negotiators are deeply versed not only in the technical issues and nuclear technology and sanctions law, but also in the psychological and procedural tactics to wear down Americans. They view diplomacy as an extension of Iran's broader strategic resistance doctrine. The approach is highly centralized, disciplined, and coordinated with Tehran's top leadership. By contrast, the U.S. team
باز لەوە دەکرێت کە نەبوونی متمانە لە نێوان ئەم دوو وڵاتەدا وای کردووە کە گفتوگۆکان بە شێوەیەکی خێراتر نەڕوا بەڕێوە و لەگەڵ لە هەمان کاتدا بوونی نیەت زۆر جار باز لەوە دەکرێت ئەڵێ ئێران لەژێر فشاردا هاتوۆتە نێو ئەم گفتوگۆیەوە.
Well, there is no foundation for trust because There is no grounding, there is no record of success, and quite frankly, the regime is deeply antagonistic to the United States, ideologically so. This is part of US failing to understand the other side. The fact is that any trust has to be built on incremental gestures and not on any sort of ideological compromises, because there won't be any. The Iranian regime is not going anywhere. It's not going to change. And the mythology about alleged moderates versus hardliners is just that. It's a projection of Iranians' propaganda to the West. It's not reflective of any reality. The regime is deeply anti-American. Its geopolitical hegemonic ambitions and Khomeini's doctrine and relative fucky structure is not going anywhere either, and US cannot change it through negotiations or diplomacy. So the only way to build any sort of trust in negotiations will have to be by focusing on tactical steps and leave ideology to the side, keeping in mind Iran's long-term objectives that are also not going to change. And this agreement is only going to be tactical. It's not going to be uh, any sort of broad structural agreement. US is trying to accomplish too much with having very little tools to do that. The team that has to build on these issues has been assembled hastily after a lot of personnel turnover. It suffers from a limited institutional memory of past failures and strategic inconsistency. It's going to be very difficult for them to build any foundations and not be outplayed by Iranians who have not changed their teams, who have had institutional memory of decades of assorted negotiations with various administrations, and who have had the same regime in power for over 45 years at this point.
زۆر باشە بەڕێز ئێرینا دەمێت بۆ چوونت لەباریەوە کە بزانم ئایا ئەم کۆبوونەوانە درێژە دەکێشەیە خود لە ماوەیەکی کورتی داهاتوودا بە ئەنجام دەگات ئەگەر هاتوو درێژی کێشا لەمپەر نایەتە بەردەم گفتوگۆکان و وە کێشەی بۆ دروستکا بە تایبەتی کە پێشتر لەگەڵ دەستپێکردنی گفتوگۆکانە ئیسرائیل ئاماژی بۆ کردبوو کە ئێمە ڕازی نابین گفتوگۆکان درێژ بکرێتەوە.
I'm afraid so, unless US wakes up and realizes that once again they're being led into the same trap of endless negotiations that the Obama administration ended up getting into. There are forever wars and there are forever negotiations, and Iran is particularly masterful at wasting time. And so long as they keep agreeing to minor things, it's to their advantage to keep dragging this out. There is a fallacy called the sunken cost fallacy. The US feels more and more invested into the process the more they meet with the Iranians, and they also don't want to lose face. There is a lot of PR pressure, and there's also a misunderstanding that the longer the diplomacy continues, the more the other side is also invested into having a constructive result of some sort. But that's not the case. For Iranians, the process is a way to gain psychological advantage of the Americans. It's not a way to resolve issues because there's nothing to resolve. Iranians want to survive the 4 years of the Trump administration without being attacked, and if possible, to get some sanctions lifted and to come to some minor policy understanding that will not require any serious commitment on their side, just as what happened with the JCPOA, but with even less commitment on their if possible. Let's recall that JCPOA was never actually signed by Iran. It actually ended up being a series of policy by the Obama administration, never ratified as a treaty, never signed by anybody. So this process allows Iran to dictate the negotiation tempo, to drag out the talks, to extract concessions, to exploit US uncertainty, and to waste time while keeping Israel at bay. Israel is not able, without US approval, to conduct strikes on US nuclear facilities because those facilities have been relocated deep underground, and Israel lacks the sufficient force to continue a campaign of many months that would require extensive logistical and intelligence support and technological backing to be effective. It's not a matter of one or two symbolic strikes over the surface to destroy some military bases. This is a completely different of campaign, and U.S. would need U.S. cooperation and coordination too, even if they are going to go at it alone. So long as U.S. is committed to this process, Israel will not be able to do anything. So the best they can hope for is to wake the Americans up and to realize that the process of endless meetings is not going to lead to anything other than Iran winning with a very weak uh, uh, with very weak cards, with a very weak hand, and essentially fooling the US into either softening the position or giving them the sort of diplomatic and psychological break that they need to for internal propaganda and to rebuild their weakened infrastructure, weakened military proxies, and essentially start another propaganda campaign.
زۆر باشە بەڕێز ئێرینا پێشببینی دەکەن لە ماوەیەکی داهاتوو نزیکدا گفتوگەکان بچنە قۆناغێکی نوێەوەیش قۆناغی چاوپێکەوتنیان گفتوگۆی ڕاستەوخۆ بن لەگەڵەوەی هەم لەسەر ئاستی وەزارەتی دەرەوەی هەردوولا یاخود لەسەر ئاستی کەسی یەکەمی هەردوولا کە دوێنێ دۆناڵد ترامپ ئامادەی خۆی دەربڕیوە کە ئامادەیە لەگەڵ کەسی یەکەمی ئێران عەلی خامنەی یاخود سەرۆکۆماری وڵاتە کۆ ببێتەوە.
I don't expect that to happen anytime soon, and if it ever does, it would be on very humiliating terms for the US administration. Iran is looking at the situation very differently from the United States. They're in no rush to come to agreement. They don't really need or want an agreement. They want concessions. They want sanctions lifted. They want to waste American time, and they want to gain time to rebuild their proxies. They don't care about getting any sort of a peace deal with the US, and they can afford to sacrifice lives, especially the lives of their proxies like the Houthis in Yemen, while this is happening. And their strategy, I expect to be consistent. Iran approaches negotiations as part of a broader and generational struggle for strategic independence and regional hegemony. So they're not going to simply acquiesce to US demands. And even if they make some very temporary concession, they will reserve the right to cheat and go back on it later. Tehran is also seeks to advance its objectives through very small, reversible steps, each designed to preserve core capabilities. So expect the meetings to not be particularly fruitful in terms of major progress, much less getting to the point of very high-level meetings. This is not the same situation with Saudi Arabia, where the country had diplomatic relations for a very long time, had a temporary break, and then restored them and immediately return to very significant economic relations. That would not happen with the United States, regardless, so Iran does not feel the need to rush. And of course, expect deception and ambiguity, because for Iran, negotiations are more of a cover for parallel advancements in nuclear and military capabilities. So while these meetings are taking place, Iran is probably still working on its nuclear program in some capacities. Finally, there is an issue of centralized control. The Iranian diplomats are tightly coordinating with the Supreme Leader Khamenei, ensuring consistency and discipline, and they will not make a move without his approval. And Khamenei has Trump exactly where he wants him. He sees that Trump is desperate for a diplomatic win. He sees that Trump is showing significant weakness with Putin. He sees that Trump is not committed to a very serious long-term American presence in the Middle East. So Khamenei has no need to meet with him to get what he wants out of Trump. He can use lower-level diplomats to push the U.S. in the direction Iran wants. And for that, Iran is going to be using the same tools that Trump thinks he's excelling at, which is brinkmanship, psychological pressure. Iran has skillfully used it in the past, threatening escalation to drive concessions while avoiding direct war. And this is exactly the same tactic that Trump himself has used countless times, but Iran is just much better at it. And Iran is likely going to outplay Trump because he Iran has already seen Donald Trump make those concessions, one-sided concessions to Russia, where much less is at stake.
زۆر باشە بەرپرسانی ئێران لە چەند ڕۆژی ڕابردوودا باسییان لەوە کرد کە ئێمە ناتوانین لە وادەی دۆناڵد ترەمپ دایناوە بۆ کۆتایی هێنان بەو پرسا یاخود بۆ ڕێککەوتن و داوایان کردووە کە سەرەتا ڕێککەوتنێکی سەرەتایی بکرێ ئەمە تا چەند ئەمریکا بەمە ڕازی دەبێ کە لە هەمان کاتدا ئەمریکا دەزانێت درێژکردنەوەی کۆبوونەوەکان و گفتوگۆکان ینی ئامانج لێی ئێرانە واخود ئێران دەوێت دوور بکەیتەوە لە هەڕەشەکانی ئەمریکا.
Well, quite frankly, that's just another way of games, another sort of game that Iranians are playing just to push the envelope and to see where they can get U.S. to agree easily to something much less than what they had agreed. And it's a form of concession to Iran because they are proposing their own terms. Now, U.S., I don't expect them to agree to that right away, but unfortunately, U.S. seems to be repeating the same pattern of behavior in these talks as they have under completely different administration, under Obama during JCPOA, and even before that, under multiple other diplomatic, multiple other administrations in other diplomatic contexts. They are showing excessive initial optimism, frequently misinterpreting tactical flexibility as a strategic shift, and this could be one of those instances. They are prioritizing crisis de-escalation, seeking short-term reductions in tensions rather than addressing Iran's structural ambitions. And this is yet another opportunity to fall into that trap. They are often conceding ground on verification or sunset clauses or other important steps to save agreements under domestic political pressure. So they're making concessions for deal's sake, and this interim proposal is yet another opportunity where they could easily fall into the trap. They're often failing to sustain pressure when talks stall, and if U.S. does not agree to this provision, Iran could exhibit that brinksmanship that I mentioned by stalling the talks. Washington tends to soften its demands rather than intensify strategic pressure, fearing escalation. So if U.S. does not agree to this interim proposal, Iran can pretend to walk away from the table, forcing American diplomats to chase after them. And that's very likely how they're using this talk. Finally, there is often a disillusionment and collapse. Each cycle of these negotiations ends with growing U.S. frustration and accusations of Iranian bad faith, and then eventually Iran gets U.S. to agree to something similar to what they have proposed to begin with. And that is where we are headed unless Witkoff and his team wake up and realize and study the history of negotiations and realize that all these interim proposals are manipulative tactics to force U.S. to concede and to negotiate on Iranian terms.
زۆر باشە بەڕێز ئێرینا لە ئەگەری ڕێگنەکەوتنی هەردوولادا تا چەند چاوەڕێی هێرشی ڕاستەوخۆی ئەمریکا دەکرێت بۆ سەر ئێران کە پێشتری دۆناڵد ترەمپ ئاماژەی بەوە کردبوو کە خۆم سەرپەرشتی ڕاستەوخۆی هێرشەکان دەکەم لە ئەگەری ڕێگنەکەوتنی لەگەڵ ئێراندا.
Here's the problem. He talks tough talk, but he's not willing to walk the walk. We've seen that before, and now we're seeing it again in terms of not having a clear deadline for negotiations. Supposedly, he gave Iran 2 months, 60 days to get on board with the program, but Iran can say, well, we did what you wanted. We conceded to start the negotiation process, but because of all these issues, that's obviously going to take longer than 60 days to resolve. We are negotiating in good faith. And so far, we are seeing that that U.S. is not pushing or pressuring Iran to move ahead with much more serious discussion points. After a third meeting, we are still only on technical details and written proposals, nowhere near the substantive agreements. Part of the reason is that U.S. is still overestimating the moderating influence of Iranian presidents and assorted diplomats, and basically misreading Iran's internal politics. Part of the reason is US tends to view the nuclear file as an isolated technical issue, while for Iran it's a strategic focus of a broader regional and ideological strategy. Part of it is institutional instability. It's very likely that thanks to personnel turnover within this Trump administration, we may see changes in the US team long before any deadline comes to pass. And meanwhile, the Iran system ensures strategic consistency and continuity of diplomatic presence. And of course, Trump and his entire team are underestimating Iranian ideology. They undervalue the role of Khomeinism, the emphasis on resistance, anti-Westernism, and strategic deception. So while they're making these threats, they're also believing that Iran will easily crumble to these threats. And of course, the public relation pressure, the idea that Trump wants to show a deal, to be seen as a deal maker and a peacemaker, and making all these promises, and the fact that he is not getting what he wants on the Russia-Ukraine front, and that the war in Gaza is also not being resolved as quickly as he had hoped for. These are all, important psychological pressure points and vulnerabilities that Iran is going to be exploiting very skillfully to force Trump to stick to negotiations no matter how long it takes, and to waste more time rather than to carry out on his threats and engage with Israel and attack the facilities. I don't think Iran has anything to fear in this regard.
شرۆڤەکاری سیاسی کە بەڕێزیان ڕاستەخۆ لە نیویۆرکەوە میوانیم گەشتی هەواڵ بوون دووبارە سپاس.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.